I'm Mark Seifster.
And I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
everybody. Welcome to Arcane Mark.
Today we're going to talk about GM tools, although it's sort of player tools as well. It's going to be about using ideas from different tabletop RPGs. So when we're saying using ideas from different tabletop RPGs, different than what? Well, different than whatever is the tabletop RPG that you're playing right now or GMing right now. Because sometimes you'll be playing or GMing in a tabletop RPG that isn't Pathfinder or whatever your one that you're currently playing is. And then you can use ideas from Pathfinder 2nd Edition in the other game that you're playing and vice versa.
So let's talk about like some of the types of ideas that you might want to port. Because if you get down to like the nitty gritty granular stuff, you're not going to be porting the things where it's like, yes, when I do this particular type of action, I gain a +4 bonus to my roll on this thing, or like things that are very deep mechanical, having to do with like the raw numbers of the system or the dice or things like that.
Yeah, it's not like you're going to be like, yes, I am definitely going to take this exact spell cast into time from Secrets of Magic and port all of it, mechanics and all, into Blades in the Dark.
Yes.
It's just like, that's not what you're going to do. But the main point of this idea of using ideas from different tabletop RPGs is that you're going to use the ideas. You're going to use some of the underpinnings that are behind those other tabletop RPGs to inspire you in a you basically will have a source, and then you'll have the, I guess, what would be the opposite of the source RPG here? You would have the destination RPG. And so you use ideas from the source RPG in the destination RPG.
So this may be, taking a conceptual idea of, like, let's say that there's a class in one RPG that you think is really cool and you want to get that kind of theme or flavor in a different RPG, and then you can come up with, mechanics or ideas to help replicate that general idea without one-for-one cloning the mechanics.
That's right. So
like, let's say that you were playing let's say that you're like, oh yeah, I want to play something where, I want to play something where, like, there's this character and they're, like, completely based on being able to, like, summon different kinds of monsters or whatever, and then you're taking that idea and you're bringing it into a different RPG that doesn't have that sort of thing. Or, like, I want to make a character that's about like building robots, or I want to make a character that's about doing these sorts of things. You can take those thematic ideas and bring them over. Another one that you can do is that subsystems can be less directly geared into the fundamental mechanics of the system than, like, the raw system itself. So, like, things where you have the idea of, hey, there's a tracker of victory points and you're attaining victory points to do this sort of objective. That's not something, while you may need to change, like, the thresholds of success and things like that, some of those fundamental ideas are not like, oh yeah, well, you don't have to be playing Pathfinder to do victory points.
You could use the influence system you could use it in another RPG you're playing in. Obviously, other RPGs have their own thoughts about success and failure and where that leads, so that you might need to make certain adjustments. For instance, if you're doing Apocalypse World, you failed at one of the influence checks, it's not just that you would get a penalty on influence. Like, something really bad happens because the GM is going to make a move every time that you fail something. So you do have to take that into consideration. However, I think that let's step back a moment from talking about just a few things that we can take from tabletop RPGs. Talk about how you can take and use ideas from tabletop RPGs. The way that you will be able to find best the ability to sort of find and then take something from a source RPG into a destination RPG is to put on a different lens when you are engaging with the source RPG, potentially in advance and on purpose and deliberately. And you say, okay, when I read this, when I learn this, when I play this, I'm going to be looking at some of the decisions that this RPG make, I'm going to be thinking about how it makes me feel. I'm going to be thinking about what succeeded, what was exciting, what was new and different for me, and what failed. What just didn't work out for me. What, when I read it in the rules, it was like, this is very confusing and I don't know what's going on. And you're specifically trying to find pain points as well as strong points.
And among that, you're also looking for what gives you a fundamentally different feeling that you don't... Like, let's say that you have an RPG that you play a ton, and then you're trying a new one, and then you're like, wow, you know, I haven't had this kind of a feel, this kind of a theme, this kind of like an experience in the other RPG. What is it that makes this experience different? Is it something that's
can I use it?
And then can I use that? Can I bring that over?
That's right. And when you find something that gives you a different feeling, that sense of like the game mechanic working together with the narrative can be something that you pull over into another game. So for example, suppose that you're trying to find a way in whatever system to make it feel like a character who has like divinatory abilities, sort of like knows what's going on, but in a way that's mechanical and is not about like you just as the GM metagamingly telling them information. You might take a look at how other RPGs handle this, and maybe you would look at Pathfinder 2e and some of the abilities like the Diviner Focus spell that lets you peek at a secret check's result. That's a very mechanical ability, but it also really gives you the feeling of you know what's going on, even though it doesn't require lots of metagame information. That's something you might be able to use in a concept in another RPG when you're GMing it, of like, okay, this has certain checks that are secret, but maybe for the character who has really divination abilities, I would let them peek at some of the results. Spend some resource in this game, a stress or a special point or something like that, to look at the results, peek past the veil.
One of the things that I think is cool and that I've seen in some other systems is compared to like Pathfinder and things like that, are ones that have a different structure for how they assume that you do character creation collaboratively and world creation collaboratively. Since the Pathfinder kind of assumes more that it's like, oh yeah, you know, the GM is making the world, you might be presenting things that are in Golarion, for example, and then the players are making their characters. You're probably going to have a first time that you get together, you know, a session 0 to talk things through. But some other systems, like when you look at some of the stuff that some of like the Fate system does with, hey, you know, we can come together and come up with how were your characters related or connected before this story. Things like that don't, you know, you may not then have, oh yeah, you know, I have this aspect that's a mechanical thing that my character has that they're going to be using in the story that comes out of that, but you could still say, okay, yeah, you know, they have that connection, and so that connection is going to inform things in the story. Maybe that connection might cause them to be more likely to get circumstance bonuses on checks that are related to that particular story hook.
That's right.
Or like when you have things where it's like, you know, let's build aspects for the scene and the setting and things like that. That sort of thing would totally work in a system neutral fashion, as long as you're not expecting it to be like, oh, and there's a direct mechanic for that.
And even then, you could still make a mechanic for it. Instead of just an aspect that you tag to get a bonus in Fate, it could be something that provides a circumstance bonus or penalty, or that in Pathfinder 2 you spend an action to interact with in some way and cause an effect during the fight. Yeah,
so you're like, well, you know, this, if you're like, well, I know that this particular warehouse, you know, has an aspect that has to do with it being like, you know, poorly maintained and run down, so I'm going to use that I'm going to tag that aspect and spend an action to see if I can, like, you know, if I can, like, mess up something on the floor so that this person might be tripped or something like that.
Or cause the ceiling to collapse
on them and make my own little improvised trap, or do some other sort of thing that directly influences the...
And Sean Wolf says stunting is incredibly important to their PF2 games, and sometimes it adds bonus if you impress them with how you do the attack.
Oh, cool.
And the original system for stunting was that they're basing that off of was from Exalted. So yeah, that's a great example of taking something bringing it into another tabletop RPG. Here's another idea. Let's say your group, for whatever reason, is just like, I just can't visualize the victory points. I know you're telling me I need 8 victory points and that we're getting 2 or 1 or -1, but numbers don't do it for me. I just don't feel it. You could be like, well, in a lot of other RPGs, they use clocks for pretty much exactly the same thing as this.
So then you have the circle with these different wedges in it that you fill in.
You draw the circle with 8 wedges, and when the victory points are being gained, you fill it in. If you lose one, you erase it. And maybe the clock is something that they're like, yeah, I get the clock. Now I see, oh, wow, we're close on this one. And you could have another clock that just fills it automatically by one per tick when they use up their time ticks for that subsystem. And you're like, oh, this clock is running out. I hope we can finish our good clock of victory points before the time clock gets all the way to the end.
And one thing you mentioned earlier, sort of the sense of the consequences of failure and the gravity of failure, that's a thing that you could also port over thematically. If you say, okay, yeah, well, in this game it's this we're running a more horror game, and like when you fail your checks, like critical failures are really, really bad and that sort of thing, and are more likely to have larger scale consequences, or maybe even regular failures have something that is somewhat smaller that's going on, and then you could recalibrate there based on what kind of expectations you want to have. And then you'd still want to then think about, where do I want to set my DCs? How hard is it to succeed if failure is like a serious problem? But that's right. And then critical failure is like, oh my god.
You could go from a psychological horror game, like there's a lot of those with that sense of creeping dread and anxiety building up, and use that to be like, yeah, maybe on a critical failure, and you'd want to make sure to, like, because of multiple attack penalties, to maybe not do it on attack rolls. So, like, anything except for an attack roll, perhaps. On a critical failure, you gain, like, 1 dread point.
Yes, as your character becomes more and more
unsettled by what's going on, and more anxious, and, like, as those creep up, more things start happening.
Yes.
And critical successes don't make it go down, but there might be ways to, like, when you rest, it can go down, and you get that psychological horror that also puts its own different pacing system on there, taken from various horror games and bringing in there.
And then you might have something, for example, where dread point thresholds after time impose conditions.
And Shan is wondering if we're strictly speaking of systems or also setting elements. Both. Linda started with some examples of how you could take setting elements, and you might not want to take the exact mechanics both times. But, so really anything. Whenever you expose yourself to another tabletop RPG, you are basically kind of gaining experience points. It's something I've said before on a similar topic, which is, if you play your favorite tabletop RPG that you've played forever with your friends, it's generally, like, in your comfort zone. It may even, sometimes you wind up doing something very difficult that's within that, and that might be an encounter that's not a trivial encounter, but sometimes it may be a trivial encounter where you're not getting that much XP and leveling up as a player and a GM. Whereas when you go out of your comfort zone and try something completely different, it could be a severe encounter because you have no idea what you're going to come up against, and you gain more experience.
Yeah, well, because if you're only playing one system, then it's easy to think that some of the assumptions that are baked into that system are just how tabletop RPGs are, as opposed to artifacts of that very specific system.
That's right. And tune in on our next episode on Saturday when we talk about different incentives and how designers can vary them. As the GM and a player, you're on the other side of that mirror, and you may have just gotten so locked into the incentives of your main system that you don't realize that systems can exist that have very, very different incentives.
Yeah, for example, are experience points in your system always something that goes up? What are the resources that our players have available to spend? How much time is there between when characters get stronger, and how much of an impact does it make when characters get stronger? Some of these fundamental assumptions that are baked into that.
Absolutely. And so when you start taking a look at those assumptions, because you play multiple different RPGs, it allows you to pull from the best parts of the RPGs that you've been playing, as well as challenge the assumptions, and in some cases, uphold the assumptions, but do so knowing why you chose to do so, which allows you to use those assumptions in a way that's stronger and sort of more intentional. Whereas then kind of you accidentally do it, it's harder to emphasize that it's important. Whereas when you know you're doing it and it's important, you could prop it up with supporting elements and other themes in your game that really sort of makes it pop.
I'm thinking about, we just a few days ago played Fabula Ultima for the first time, and one of the interesting things about that game for me is that like in combat, there's no such thing as distance. It's just like, oh yeah, everything you can travel any arbitrary amount of time, and like melee versus range just makes a difference in terms of like whether you can attack, whether you can hit like certain types of targets or whatever. Like you can't hit a target that's flying with melee, and I thought that was really interesting because it's like, oh yeah, I'm used to the idea that you have some kind of spatial representation in your game, but that's not universal. Or that game also has an inventory point system where you don't decide ahead of time, oh I'm carrying 7 minor healing potions and 5 and 5 scrolls, and here's the spells they are, or whatever, and you're just like, okay, I have this many inventory points, and then I can spontaneously decide, oh yeah, by the way, that was like a healing potion or a magic healing potion, or like that was an item that does damage to my enemies or what have you.
Which is vaguely reminiscent of Blades in the Dark.
Yeah.
Which was listed as one of the influences of Fabula Ultima.
Yeah, but those kinds of
not
games...
as much as Ryutama, the Japanese RPG, which was apparently the main influence.
But like, those kinds of games have a very different way of handling, what are you carrying around with you? So like, so you might consider, a fundamental assumption is that you know what you have in your bag before you start playing, or that you've made your plans before you start playing. Like that's really with Blades in the Dark, where it's like, okay, you make a basic description of you're doing a heist, because that's what the system's about, and you make a basic description of your main approach, and then the GM describes challenges that you're coming across, and then you decide how you had totally planned for that. And if the thing that you are saying that you plan for like is reasonable, and like, oh yeah, obviously that makes a lot of sense, then maybe you can just kind of go for it. But then if it seems like it's a little bit of a stretch, then your character will take stress to try to say that they had totally planned for that all along. So like, when I think about something like that, I think about, okay, yeah, you can totally have something where you have where you're running a heist, and you have in another game, and you're saying, all right, well, I don't need you to spend 4 hours planning in advance. We can say that we can like kind of come up with a general plan, and then maybe instead of taking stress, you're like rolling a check to see how well you did in a particular type of preparation.
In Blades, you roll a check as well.
Yeah, you roll a check, but I'm saying like if you were going to try to do something like that
in Pathfinder, maybe you would have another.
Or maybe you have
another resource.
Yeah, you have like a points, like preparation points.
Yeah, be like gather preparation points generically instead of spending 4 hours saying what you were doing, and now you're like you have 5. Okay, if you need to do a flashback, spend these for flashbacks or something like that.
And there's preparation resources in Pathfinder Heist as well, but it's not like exactly the same,
it's a little different.
But you could do something like that. But yeah.
So, let's see. It looks like David Nielsen mentioned combining some Blades in the Dark and Fate with some GURPS and Pathfinder. Yeah, you could absolutely use things from multiple different systems, and it can absolutely work out. And Rico points out that inventory is huge, because having no option in your system for effectively ignoring inventory has a major impact on the entire system and adventure design.
And you think about things like, how does your system handle like bulk and weight and carrying things around? Is your system a kind of system where you can hold like, 99 large tables and carry them around with you and do these kinds of things? Or is your system one where you're tracking that sort of thing more precisely? Does your system care if you have like 20 arrows or 21, or is it just like, yes, you have a bow, we assume you have the arrows?
And we'll talk more about inventory and treasure as incentives in the incentives episode, but it is definitely true that inventory is going to have a big impact for you, and that if you try to have your cake and eat it too, where you're like, oh, you don't really need these items, we'll assume that you don't have them. You're gonna get messed up. Like that happened in D&D 5th edition, for example, and it's gonna cause you issues.
I want to talk about another thing that I sort of learned about more recently with a light novel we were reading, and then that also showed up in Fabula Ultima, which is the idea of like a game master scene where like the GM shows like a little bit of what's going on with the villains behind the scene is like a cutscene in the middle of a thing. It's like,
I've seen that happening before, but that being an accepted term that is used, it's like, yeah, this is a game master scene, is something that in Japanese tabletop RPGs seems to be more of a like a standard terminology.
Yeah, whereas like I had generally heard of it more like, oh yeah, you want to be careful about how much you're doing that. You want to make sure the players are always directly involved in what's going on. So like I hadn't really considered so much the idea of, oh yeah, we're going to take a moment and peel back the curtain and show the players something that their characters wouldn't necessarily see. Because normally when you have that, it'll be like, oh yeah, only these two characters are here, but all the players are watching and they're like, oh, haha. But like, it's like, oh, you actually could do something like that where you show them something else and there's a way to do those things. So you see those in other media all the time, but I hadn't associated with TTRPGs until I saw that.
Yeah, and I think that those could be fun because we were just talking about the other day about like how do you get backstory to players and not just have people keep diaries constantly. And we even said like just kind of doing a scene like that is a possibility, but in some RPGs it's a lot more codified than in others. For example, in Fabula Ultima, the GM is supposed to do a scene like that when the villain's plot advances, which generally happens when the PCs rest and recover their resources. Then the villain's plot advances and you do a scene. And if the villain shows up, including in a scene that the PCs aren't in, the PCs gain the special point, the special reroll point that also winds up becoming XP only when it's used. So if in fact, if GMs were stingy with showing those scenes, it would influence the PC's ability to level up and to use points to like reroll their failed checks in the system.
Well, that was another cool thing too, where it's like we were talking about like XP being interlaced with other mechanics, where it's like you can, that where we've seen other ones where it was like you can spend your XP for a reroll, but this is like you spend your reroll to get XP.
And I'm gonna just go in the middle here and just say that there are many different designs of tabletop RPGs. I think there's something to be learned and something cool about just about all of them, but one of my few pet peeves for me personally, and I think a significant amount of gamers, pet peeve is gaining XP that if you eventually just keep hoarding it, you will level up past your fellow PCs. But if you don't, and you could just spend it to get rerolls, and then it's gone, and you do not level up as quickly. Whether or not you try to do a catch-up mechanic by putting social pressure on people to give Timmy, the person who's profligately spending rerolls, more XP at the end of the session that's like a socially divided ones, or not. I think whether you do that or not, it's bad and it causes serious problems.
But so, I like to be, yeah.
Now, if you're someone who designed a tabletop RPG that does that, I'm not calling you out here because all the ones I know of have some really other amazing aspects of them that I think are cool. I just really don't like that particular decision because for me, as a resource hoarder, I am never, ever going to take the reroll unless I'm like either about to die or something really, really horrible is going to happen. And even then, I'll feel bad about it. And then I wind up sometimes multiple levels ahead of the person who's just like, oh, I failed that attack roll. I'm going to re-roll it.
So what did you think about the system where like you have to spend your re-rolls in order to get the XP?
Oh yeah, I liked that. That was great.
It pushes you to get the XP.
That one, which is in Fabula Ultima, is great.
Yeah.
It's the opposite. But the one where it's like, don't it is hoard to level up and spend to
Yeah.
not level up. I think that
This is getting a little more into the incentives topic, I think, but
it totally is.
mm-hmm.
But I think that it is something that is one of the few things I can just definitively say that really rubs me the wrong way in a game.
So I see an example here. Chris Abbott had a GM who would have the players roll perception checks, and if they all failed, use camera 2 to show the enemy peering down at them from ambush points, so the players knew what was about to happen. That's awesome.
Yeah. And Rico likes the base assumption that PF2 has even level parties.
Where everyone's the same level, yeah. And then is impressed by how well PFS2 plays with PFS and blended levels. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, people at first thought that it couldn't work with blended levels, but with the system there for like the points of determining the challenge points of like how strong the party is, it works out. There's a little adjustments along the way to make sure to help pull the bootstraps up of the really, really low level character that's stuck into the adventure, but
you're basically using a system similar that's kind of a mirror to the system of the way that you build encounters for the PCs to fight against, to build up the strength, to build up and come up with a good sense of what the strength of the party is overall, and therefore what set of challenge is equivalent.
I remember that my little brother was just at Gen Con. He likes to razz us if there's anything that he thinks is a problem, but he said that his group wound up with some situation where they had someone who was like level 1 who was in a higher sub-tier adventure, and he was very impressed by the fact that his friend's first level character, with the adjustments and boosts from that were given, was able to like not outshine the higher level characters, but do well, and everyone seemed to have a good time, and he thought that worked pretty well. Which I thought he was going to say that it didn't work, but that wasn't the case.
That's true.
So I think it works great, and that's another example of something that's maybe even in the same tabletop RPG, but is a different style of play, organized play, and it can teach you something about your home games if you wanted to do groups with different levels.
Different groups with different levels, or if you wanted to have like a thing where it's like, oh yeah, you know, you use consumables a little differently. You start each thing with a free consumable, and then we wound up then saying, hey, look, this is totally the garden system.
That's true. That is the garden system that I wrote for Treasure Vault.
Treasure Vault, because you made that system, which totally...
I was definitely aware that it was similar to the system that was in organized play.
Yeah.
And also just like, to me, that garden system was more of something that I would use, because I'll use things that are like, maybe only at the end of the day, but I will use things that come back every day, whereas if I can just stockpile,
I'll stockpile the Dark Souls Estus Flack, where it's like, well, if you don't lose it, you use it, you lose it, so, like, you should use it.
And that's something you can also learn from other tabletop RPGs, because there are definitely tabletop RPGs that have the more Dark Souls Estus Flack style of consumables.
And when you have that, then you know, there's no point. You can't just hoard up to the giant sack that you don't touch, and then you're like, oh man, we should have used that 5 levels ago, and now we out-leveled that item. You're saying, okay, well, we get something that's kind of appropriate for our level, and you know, and then that refreshes over time, and then we use that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, basically, every time you come across another tabletop RPG, if you want to learn from it, I'm just kind of asking you to take a moment, and you don't have to put this frame on before you go into it. You can do it afterwards. Debrief yourself for a little. Be like, what did I like? What would I take? What would I use? What did I not like? How could I learn from why I didn't like that? And each time you do that, I think you're going to add another facet to your role playing, to your GMing, and to being a player. And Shanwell says, like media literacy, but for tabletop RPGs. Yeah, basically, yes. And eventually, you're going to have all these tricks in your toolbox that people who maybe only played the one tabletop RPG that you play the most might not have access to some of those.
And
tricks.
I remember, like, when you first started at Paizo, you were spending a lot more. You were like really learning a lot about a lot of different RPGs and that you hadn't seen before and how they worked and diving into that. And I know that was super helpful to being like, hey, here to breaking out of the existing assumptions from the games that you played and trying out a lot of new stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see it talking about using Jenga towers for time mechanics and unspeakable words as a way for players to make unique magic words and design a cantrip around the world they made. Absolutely. Like, when you have subsystems, there's no reason those have to be, like, using the same mechanics of the game. You can totally be like, oh, yeah, we have this thing, and we're going to resolve it using this different game. I mean, heck, you could even have something where you like, say, we went through this weird dimensional portal and now our characters are warped in some way, and then you're playing like an entirely different TTRPG for a session where you've kind of made analogs of your characters and they come out on the other side of that and they go back to their game having learned something, and perhaps with like some weird items or abilities that are relics of the experience they've had.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a good way to go about things. And then there's another example about importing the luck stat from Fallout or Special and having it work like fortune and misfortune effects. I mean, you could have a luck stat that that gives rerolls a certain number of times. Mm-hmm. I mean, essentially, if you think about it, you could replace hero points with a luck stat that was its own ability score, and whatever your modifier is, that's how many rerolls that you get within a certain period of time.
Mm-hmm. So then you could choose to invest into that kind of thing instead.
Yes. You could. You would probably want to have something where going down, surviving at 0 did not take all of them, no matter how many you have, because that would sort of encourage some people to just like stay at +1 luck stat to get 1 and then never use it for anything except for to survive or to reroll something that would kill them. Because if you have maxed it out and gotten like 4 or 5, you still would lose all of them when you're surviving.
You may want to do something there where you're like, you also have like a survive counter, and it's like, okay, you can only do this many survives per day.
Yes. Or you make the survive one like once.
Yeah.
You'd be like, once per session you can survive. It doesn't cost you anything. You just can. And then you also have this luck stat that you can use. So you could totally do that.
Folks are talking about Starfinder 2 Pathfinder crossovers. Those are going to be amazing.
You're not even going to need this episode to do that, because all you're going to need to do is go into the Pathfinder 2 thing and take it entirely into Starfinder, it sounds like. For Starfinder, you will need to apply your thinking cap a little bit, because Starfinder has assumptions that are different according to the Starfinder team. And in all cases that I've seen, they're assumptions that would not cause any problems pulling Pathfinder, but may cause problems putting the Starfinder into Pathfinder if you don't look into, like, flying at low levels where Pathfinder can't handle it, but Starfinder can.
So to speak to something whose specifics I'm not familiar with, and therefore I can just speculate on, like, I could imagine, with the kinds of ranges on weapons that you would have by default in Starfinder, and the fact that you have, like, this profusion of ranged options from low levels, then, some of the opponents that you might have in Pathfinder that would be designed to not necessarily, or low level, don't necessarily have ranged attacks, don't have ways to deal with these kinds of things, like, they may have more trouble.
Especially, you're just flying around shooting with guns from a range. So, importing in that direction, I think you're going to have to check your assumptions on ranged combat on that. And also, we haven't really heard anything about this, but Starfinder 1 at least had a sort of, you must be able to get to any of the pack worlds at low levels, so therefore you can survive in any environment really easily thing. That if that maintains, that could also be a similar thing to look at.
So if you compared like a Starfinder 1 armor that would make you immune to like harmful gases, and then you like put in temperature and things like that.
Then that would be like a first level thing that caused almost nothing in Starfinder 1.
So then those kinds of things wouldn't actually be the kind of challenge that you would throw. You would still You would still consider that. But
I don't think they've made it as clear if that one's gonna stay as an assumption in Starfinder 2, as they have that flying and ranged kiting is going to be like assumed in Starfinder 2.
I don't recall seeing anything announced about that one.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything stated. So the point is, there's gonna be like what 2, 3, 4 things to look at, and then otherwise you can just pull it from Starfinder into Pathfinder, and all of those things are on the side of Starfinder's stuff being like more disruptive to the meta of Pathfinder than vice versa. So it sounds like everything you could pull from Pathfinder to Starfinder without thinking about it, other than being like, well, maybe this flying option is too high level.
Yeah, David, because like to be fair, you are thousands of years in the future. So like it totally makes sense. Should be. Yeah.
But you could be like, I can strengthen this option because it's higher level and it doesn't need to be in Starfinder. But if you didn't, and you were like, well, whatever, I'll just use Strix. And yes, the Strix feat doesn't need to be 13th level to fly in Starfinder, but they'll just take a jetpack and it doesn't matter. Or you could change it and be like, yeah, the Strix feat is now much lower level than it was.
I'm sure there will be plenty of work going into making that as seamless as possible.
Yep.
For folks who want to mix them up.
There could even be sidebars that just explain, hey, these are the ones to look at. And it's going to be super easy. You won't need this episode.
Yeah, I was talking about more like,
thing.
what if like your Pathfinder characters like crash landed into World of Darkness temporarily when they went to Earth in the past. It was World of Darkness Earth and then they came back, or whatever. Something that's really, really wild.
It's like, now I've appeared in World of Darkness. Why do the Bard and the Sorcerer have so much better stats than everybody else when you add up all of your attributes? The Bard and Sorcerer are like, sorry, but our Charisma stat has been split into 3 different stats.
Yes.
We're just better than all y'all. There's nothing you can do about it. Your stats have been not split into 3 different stats.
Yeah, you would probably have. I imagine he would be like building them, and you'd be like, "Well, here's what you have in terms of points," and then like you probably have like spending more of those flex. Like those characters would probably be spending more of those flex points to build up their stats, whereas other characters would be spending some more of their flex points to get like other special abilities.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and it's just like it's a good example of looking at ways that you can learn things from one game and pull it into another game, or even convert a character between different systems for weird crossovers.
Mm-hmm. Mecha Strix.
It is Mecha Strix. A giant Mecha Strix that fights against a kaiju-sized dragon.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's about what I wanted to say in terms of using ideas from different tabletop RPGs when you're playing in your destination game.
Likewise.
So I think this is a good time to say bye to YouTube and then close on out. So bye YouTube.
Bye!
See you next time.